Well, I have 4 panelists with me, all of whom are professional therapists. We have some amazing panels today, as you can see on the schedule. We have a heart types panel, a gut types panel, a head types panel, a parents panel. But this particular panel is for creating some space to talk about mental health with some mental health professionals about their observations about each Enneagram type in therapy. So this panel is going to be perfect for any Enneagram enthusiast looking to get insights or patterns about how their type approaches mental health and maybe what some of the barriers might be to healing and growth. But this panel is also going to be perfect for therapists who use the Enneagram or are thinking about using the Enneagram more in their practice. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Whitney Russell Stabile. Can you just wave so we can?
Hi.
And we have Eden Hyder. And then Leslie Bley. And then Joanne Kim. And Eden is on the Heart Types panel along with Joanne. So you can go over to the Heart Types panel and hear a little bit more of their story. But before we jump into our observations, I'd love for you guys just to give a little brief bio of yourself so we can get to know you. Whitney, would you mind going first?
Sure. So I'm Whitney, and I'm married to Joel Stabile, and we have 4 wonderful kids. We're a blended family, so it's a yours, mine, and ours situation. So there's lots of lovely logistics that go along with that. I've been a therapist since 2009, and I'm a licensed professional counselor supervisor. I'm a certified eating disorder specialist consultant, and I'm also EMDR trained. And I own a group practice called Brave Haven Counseling in Richardson, Texas.
Amazing. And you are type 1, correct?
I'm a type 1. That is right. And you
Okay.
made the type 1 go first. Like I didn't get to learn what to expect from what everybody else said.
I know you're prepared. So, Eden, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Eden Hyder. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, formerly lived in Texas, and have partnered with Whitney in the past, which has been really fun. I have a practice with my husband, Michael Hyder, who's also a therapist. He's an Enneagram 9. I'm an Enneagram 2. And the practice is called Inside Out Collaborative. Also have some creative projects that I've dabbled in over the years. One is a podcast called Inside Out Podcast, which focuses on attachment and providing kind of psychoeducational material on attachment and how to integrate that into our concepts of ourselves and our relationships. And that's kind of where my specialty is, as well as in eating disorders and anxiety and depression.
Great, Eden. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have Leslie Bley, who have interviewed on a past summit. And so it's good to have you back, Leslie. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's fun to be back. Leslie Bley. I live in Austin, Texas. I've been a therapist for about 20 years. I'm an LPC and supervisor here. And I am married to an Enneagram 9. I'm an Enneagram 6. And my husband and I have twin boys that are 13. So it is a lot of unique smells and sounds and sights in my house. But it's a lot of fun. And then part of my practice is working with groups. I run a group for women throughout the year called Compassionate Community Therapy. And it's modeled after attachment and motion regulation, story work. And then I also run groups for therapists called Business Vitality. And it's to help support therapists who are often feeling super alone in their own formation and in their business sense. And I come from a business background, but a therapist heart. And so I try to mix those in these support and business, style groups. And then I also try to do regular Enneagram for counselors trainings and webinars, since there's not a whole lot out there giving tons of real straightforward, credible ways to integrate this into our work. So that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie. And last but not least, Joanne Kim. Joanne, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am an Enneagram and brain spotting therapist in the Silicon Valley, so in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I, in classic 4 fashion, where I get bored very easily, I have 3 businesses that now I think about, I'm like, I probably should have just stuck with the one. But I love what I do. In my therapy practice, a lot of my clients are 9s, 1s, 2s, and 4s, so most of the right side of the Enneagram. Because my people tend to struggle with a lot of anxiety, guilt, and shame, partially because they have an allergic reaction to anger. So one of my hats is as an Enneagram therapist. Some of my other hats are around creating an online school for feelings, because there's a lot of things that I cover with my clients where they're like, I really wish I'd learned this in school. And I'm like, got it. I will make one. So that is my joy. It keeps me up at night just because it's a lot of work, but it's something that I feel like I've been brought on this planet to do. So I am a self-preservation 4, married to a social 1 with my work wife, who is a sexual 2. And so I got both of my arrow types covered. And we definitely grow and stretch each other in all the interesting ways possible. So happy to be here and happy to share things related to mental health and how the Enneagram helps inform our path forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joanne. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to go around the Enneagram, starting with type 1, and I want to spend about 5 to 7 minutes or so on each Enneagram type, talking about maybe 1 or 2 observations that you all have. Not all of you have to share about each type, because we have to put some boundaries and limitations on our time. It's hard enough to talk about the Enneagram with one person for an hour, but it's going to be a little challenging. But I think we're gonna be able to uncover some great stuff today. So let's start with type 1, and we can just jump in. And really, again, what we're trying to do is just to share some observations so that we can help people maybe recognize some patterns in their own type, and also to help some therapists who are interested in using the Enneagram in their practice to know what to expect if somebody wants to do the Enneagram, and what to look out for. So super excited about this conversation. So anyone can jump in now. What about type 1s? What are you seeing in your practice?
I'll say that sometimes type 1s are looking for the perfect therapist. So they often struggle with just kind of the imperfection and journey of therapy. It takes them a while to really trust a therapist, because that inner critic and all of the deep shame that they have, like, it's going to be a while before they're really vulnerable with that deep stuff. And then once they have established that fit, it's really hard to leave that therapist.
So you are saying that, Leslie, too, when they don't terminate, they just want to continue on in therapy for a really long time? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or just not want to even consider transitioning maybe to a different modality. Maybe it's time to work on something from a different angle, but that trust is established and it just doesn't feel easy or good to leave. Mm-hmm. And that's been my experience with multiple Enneagram 1s.
Yeah, I like thinking about 1s as the improvers, because often they're like called the perfectionists and reformers, and I think that applies to some 1s, but the spirit of the term improver, I think, captures like the intentions of those who are 1s, and often other people experience them as being like critical or judgmental, but it's really from this like sense of being connected with this ideal of like the perfect world, or how the world ought to be. And so it can be really lonely for a lot of 1s who have that sense, because other people don't see it. And so I think one of the things that often get missed with 1s is that sadness from not being seen in one's experiences, being on this like mission to like help the planet be better, and then also being misunderstood and rejected by other people.
Do you guys see any particular mental health challenges or disorders? I know a few of you specialize in eating disorders, and things like that. Do you see any patterns there with type 1s?
Type 1s tend to be more on the like restrictive behaviors and or over exercising. Everyone, I tell people like when they slip over into 7, there might be some binging there. But then they'll come back to 1 and then be mad at themselves for all the things that they did at 7.
That makes sense. That's
Yeah,
a
Yeah,
good
it
point.
feels like there's a
and control.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, exactly. I was gonna say there's a need for that structure, which I think that the passion for justice, which comes from that really sweet space, almost that connection to that ideal that you were talking about, Joanne, that need for control and structure. And I think the eating disorder can really, as well as maybe other mental health systems, can offer like a respite from the world, which feels out of control, or from their emotions, which feel out of control at times.
I'd say like anxiety and depression has a certain flavor for ones, in that, I mean, I think for ones, like depression doesn't look how we typically think of depression, like being in one's feels and like just like, you know, whining and complaining, but it's more of like the existentially type, like in being more resigned, like I don't get to have my wants and needs because like I have to always be on and be responsible. And so it's kind of one's own individuality, personal wants and needs kind of take the backseat if it's like available at all. And so there's this, I mean, I think that's partially why there's so much resentment build up, but it's not necessarily just resentment because other people aren't willing to show up for them. Ones have actually eliminated that option for other people by stepping into those roles themselves first. But to step away from that feels really scary because then it's out of control and out of their agency. It's kind of a cycle that they get into.
Yeah. Ones usually do look super functional. And a lot of the mental health stuff that they're going through, like even with OCD or depression, anxiety, eating disorders, they're usually still very functional, which I think is one of the reasons why it's hard for them to see that there's a problem. Like my therapist tells me I'm a long sufferer. Like it takes me a long time to actually like acknowledge that there's a problem because I can be so functional.
And isn't that kind of the power of
That's good.
anger as your core emotion to like keep you feeling active?
It's very energizing.
Right. Doesn't feel depressed.
All right, let's move on to type 2.
I'm curious about Eden's experience.
Yeah.
Same.
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah. When I see type 2s, I think I see it's because there's so much relational instability or distress, and it's the relationship or the relational instability that brings them in, which is often interpreted as their own failure. They're failing in the relationship, and so they're coming in, and I think that can translate to a lot of resentment. Sometimes it can go into a lot of shame. And I think kind of what you said, Joanne, like telling a 1, like, what if you tried to not improve? What if you tried to actually get worse, right? In a way. Telling a 2 is, what if you tried to set boundaries? It feels, counterintuitive to a 2 that's struggling with their relationship, because that feels like you're creating more conflict, you're creating more distress, and that is really anxiety provoking for.
I tell 2s like we have to set boundaries, but then the second part is you have to reinforce the boundary. And you also have to manage your own feelings about reinforcing the boundary, because there is that fear of the disruption in the relationship, but also the shame and guilt that they feel after they set the boundary usually tends to allow them to not reinforce the boundary later. It's like they'll say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then they feel so much shame and guilt about saying no. And then they're like, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's 2 parts to the boundary battle.
So boundary work is just going to be a big deal when twos in therapy. And I'm next door as a 3 to the twos, and I resonate with that as well, like setting a boundary with kids or in parenting or anything, and then feeling like the bad guy for doing that, and then having to wrestle with that. So yeah, that's really insightful.
Usually I have to give a disclaimer to like 2 clients who are coming in for therapy. I'm like, well, I have to kind of assess where they are, because if someone is like really fused with the type 2 structure, then it's like, well, relationship is everything. And so they come in for therapy as long as their relationship, there's some stuff going on. But then once they resolve those relationships, they're like, well, I'm done, right? So they just like leave. But there are a lot of people who come in and they're like, I don't know why I keep getting in the cycle where like I'm putting in so much work in these connections, and like, why won't they love me, type of thing. And so with those people, I'm like, I'm just going to give you a heads up. You're going to come in thinking that the main thing is related to relationships, and what is actually going to happen is we're going to work on your connection with yourself, just to give them a heads up, because not everyone wants that. And so then they can like move on to the next therapist. But it's like people who do know about the Enneagram have an easier time sitting with that idea, and that they keep like getting themselves into the cycle, and they can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome.
That's really helpful, Joanne. That it's sort of therapy is sort of conditional on a relationship. You might think, well, I need help because this relationship's out of whack. I need help on that, and then I'll leave. And you're like, no, stay. We need to work on you. That's good.
Yeah, but I think if people are in that place, like as therapists, I'm like, sure, yeah, that makes sense. If anything else comes up in the future, let me know. Just kind of leave the door open, because I think twos are also more attentive to the relationship between them and the therapist. And so like I try to be more mindful about not imposing an agenda that might get them to like make sure that I'm okay or I like them, type of thing. So I kind of leave things a bit more open-ended, and it's like, yeah, whatever you're bringing in, like, let's work on that. And if they seem like, I don't know if there's something more to this, then I might bring things up more directly. Because even knowing what's going on behind the scenes for twos might feel really painful, because it feels so embarrassing compared to like fours who like want you to tell them like all the deep dark. It's like they're usually like, I want you to tell me that I'm not okay. Like with them, I need to take it more lightly.
Yeah.
I think Michael Shahan pointed out that in my interview with him that a lot of times twos are so nice that they're asking him lots of questions. He's like, no, I need to ask you the questions.
Yeah. I have twos that they need those like first couple minutes of like checking in with me almost. And we've discussed that and made that kind of a part of our contract, just to kind of ease them into the process. And I do think twos can struggle with therapy, especially if they haven't been in therapy before. They may know that they need help and know that they need to be there sitting in the room, but be very uncomfortable with the focus being on them and not really know what to do without data coming from the other person about how they're doing, what they need, how they should be in the room with the therapist.
It's that whole dependency situation. A two really defines themselves based on what the feedback they're getting from the person that they're sitting there in relationship with currently. And if they're not getting any of that, they don't know what to do. So they're really like, when we are challenging them and saying, listen, you're the one that we're going to focus on. You're the one that all the attention's going to be on. They don't know what to do with that. It's like kind of a little disorienting for them to be the focus and to not be getting that feedback about, you're doing a good job, or I really like you, or, like we're vibing, as the kids would say.
The kids.
Yeah, the last thing that I'll say, just very specifically as an eating disorder therapist, I have never had a two in my office that hasn't believed this belief that I'm about to say. They believe that the way their body looks is either going to keep somebody in relationship with them or separate and disrupt a relationship. And so them managing how their body looks through like exercise or diet or whatever is like really important, because that is threatening to whether they will have the relationship, whether people will love them or not. And I have never sat in a session with a two that didn't believe that.
Do you know if that's the case for different genders?
TBD. I'll get back with you.
That's really good. Okay, let's talk about type 3s.
I don't find a whole lot of 3s in my practice because they're often looking for coaches, unless they're dragged into couples therapy, and even then things kind of flame out because either the shape-shifting nature of the 3 and trying to like look good in front of the therapist, or they're like, this is not moving fast enough, like let's go. Or feelings are too slow, like why are we bogging down the process? And so when I've worked with 3s, I feel like there's like a very small window in the beginning where I need to say a very concise version of why the Enneagram is important and how their type 3 pattern fits, so that I can like map out the sequence, and that we're right here. So this section in the middle might feel like a waste of time, but this is actually the fastest way to get there. And because if that window closes, then I'm like, I don't know if they'll just leave, and they don't know if it was actually useful.
Yeah. Joanne, I had every single one of those bullet points listed, so I agree. I do think that 3s can, whether they're coming, is one thing, but I think they can be a little bit of a flight risk. It's like they've worked just enough to find a little bit of relief, and then they're gone. Because that patience is real, that they really struggle with that. The only other thing that I would say is, like, if you've been working with a 3 and they've revealed some behaviors to you that aren't, like super pretty behaviors that they are really struggling with, they're probably not going to bring them up again. And so like you have to be the one that kind of intentionally checks in with them about that. Like I have clients who struggle with porn or addiction or, any other things, cheating. And so I have to be the one that's like, hey, how are you doing with that? Because they're not going to bring it up again.
Yeah, the 3s that I've had in my office, one day therapy can become another subcategory of their performance, of their like I want to accomplish something here. And so they can show up as very on task and as very like, oh, wow, you've accomplished all these things, you've done all these things, or wow, you've done so much work. And I've got a lot of circling back with them that I do. And actually what I've found really interesting with my 3 clients is family therapy, or some type of family or couples where you're seeing them in the relationship, where oftentimes they're not feeling as competent, or there is something that's happened. And that's been probably the most revealing, of seeing what's there in a 3, and then also where I've seen so much healing as well.
So good. Type 4. I'm just kidding. I'm a type 3. I just want to say this is really good, and I hope the 3s listening, if there's any, are receiving this, because it's so valuable. What I've done counseling once, and it's so hard. Just signing up for it, going to the office, it just feels so attached to feeling like a failure. Like I must be doing something wrong to be in this office getting help. And I also think that, we can, if we're doing it alone, we can sort of be a chameleon and present our best self and be the best kind of client for you. Where when I do premarital counseling, and I'm doing some premarital counseling with a few different couples right now, And it's really helpful to see them with another person in the room, because you can see the reactions, how they communicate. So I like that, Eden. I think that's really helpful to know, is you can get to know the three a little bit better when you're dealing with them, because a lot of times the friction will be in their relationships, because they'll be working so hard, and that's what it'll be. Their spouse or their kids will feel neglected, they're burnt out, all those things. And as a self-pres 3, kind of like a 1, kind of like a self-pres 4, like we can be very like masochistic, very like just grinding, and no one knows that anything's wrong under the surface. So it takes a lot for me to actually show if there's something wrong.
When something you just said, Tyler, with the 3s I've gotten to work with, and I've had a handful that have just come, to improve. 2 things. One is generally when there's like a pretty decent sized stressor that happens during our relationship, the therapy totally jettisons into something different, really starts to get to the heart of things. But almost like with a 7, sometimes there needs to be kind of a catalyst, whether it's someone else in the room or a marriage that falls apart, or a relationship or a job that falls apart that was really on their milestone benchmark list, that they really begin to do the actual feeling work that is more balancing for them. And the other thing is, there's so much, and this is heart triad, they want to achieve in work and in relationships. There's such a tension I see with 3s of succeeding in marriage and family and succeeding in jobs, and that sort of work-life balance tension that they have to find at some point. And I think that's been really neat to watch. You have such big hearts, not just trying to climb the ladder, at your job. You also want to be the best dad or the best spouse, or, I appreciate that tension for 3s.
Great thoughts, Leslie. Yeah, I think that's just helpful for 3s to help us normalize getting help, counseling. That's just part of the process of life, that you're not a failure or doing something wrong. It's normal. That's really helpful to have that. People remind us of that.
I have one more. So in the Bible for Therapists, the DSM, that highlights all these mental health disorders, whatever, in the personality disorder section, there's basically a go-to personality disorder for all of the 9 types except for type 3. And I think that's partially because the United States is a very 3-ish, 8-ish culture, and there's a lot of image orientation, things like that. And I'm also, in the Silicon Valley, which is, I think, very geared towards 3s. Like, the social context really matters, in that if a 3 has shape-shifted into being the successful persona according to their immediate context, they're not going to be able to see that their personality patterns themselves are an issue. That's why everyone else usually complains about the 3 instead of the person realizing it for themselves. And so there are certain professions, like anyone who has a public platform or a pulpit, who thinks that they're doing really well, not knowing that that's actually reinforcing their ego structure. And so I think it's important for different organizations, like communities, churches, whatever, to recognize that it is a magnet for certain personalities, in that when they shine, that's actually their ego talking. It's not really who they are. And that's part of the reason why it's so hard for 3s to actually get help, because they don't know that they're struggling.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Joanne. And wish I could elaborate on that, but for the sake of time, we'll keep moving here. But I think we said enough really helpful things for 3s. Thank you. Okay, let's move to type 4s. What do you want to say about type 4? Joanne, do you want to jump in as our type 4?
I mean, in forced fashion, I'm going to say something controversial, so.
Okay.
Disclaimer, I think psychotherapy itself is a forced playground, because therapy is designed in helping people focus on their internal world and their thoughts and feelings and their past and their trauma and all that kind of stuff. And to really do all this introspection work that 4s know how to do for free. They can do it on their own time. And so I think the trap for 4s is that they seek therapy and like end up becoming the therapist's favorite client because the therapist doesn't need to do much work because the 4 client's already there doing the things that a therapy client is supposed to do. And I think there's kind of this feedback loop that happens where the 4 client doesn't necessarily get healthier because their ego pattern is just playing itself out in therapy. And so it's important for therapists to know that that is the bias that's baked into the profession of therapy, kind of like how coaching can be very like 3-ish, 8-ish, in that my style as a therapist has changed over time to be more coaching-like. Because what a lot of 4 clients need is not more focusing on feelings and dredging up all the gunk, but to get their asses in gear and to like say, hey, these things you think is not available to you, and that's why you're struggling so much, partially because you've identified with being a suffering person. But what if you actually have good things readily available to you already? It's not out there somewhere. And maybe the only thing that's needed is for you to actually like map out the concrete steps and break it down into smaller pieces and actually follow through with those steps in the type 1-ish arrow type way. Not a lot of 4s are up for that. And so in that sense, I think it takes some discernment on the therapist's part to recognize like, what's the nature of the client I'm working with here if they're a 4? Are they here to reinforce their identity as a suffering person? Or do they recognize the trap that they're caught in and they want something different? Because if that's the case, we need to not do therapy as it's traditionally been. We actually need to do more action orientation and more body work, maybe.
So brilliant, Joanne. Thank you for sharing that, because I know there's a lot of 4s watching. I can see a lot of 4s getting excited about this summit, and a lot of therapists are 4s. They're just brilliant at this. So what you shared, the kind of the caution there, or the kind of pattern to look out for, is just extremely beneficial to the conversation. So I'm so glad to have you here to share that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Like, I think that my job working with 4 is to help them like organize their thoughts and emotions, because they can just sit there and swirl and go down deep into them. And my job, and I'm good at it because I'm a 1 and that's what I do. It's like, these go here, these go here, these go here. And now we need to make a plan. Like holding them accountable to the action. Because I think the other piece, and you touched on this, but like they over-identify with their feelings so much. Like sometimes they really fear any kind of healing. So it's like, hey, what if we aren't this depressed person anymore? Or what if we aren't like really riddled in the shame? What then? They don't know who they would be because they over-identify with those feelings so much that it can, like, even just imagining a place where they don't experience that is really hard.
Unfamiliar.
And the other thought that I put was whether they have it or not, they can present as looking like they have ADHD, an attentive type, because they can get so distracted by all the shiny objects. And because they are repressed doing, they don't get a lot done, and they struggle with like motivation to do ordinary tasks. And that's what I see a lot in my clients. Is it's like whether they actually do have ADHD or not. Sometimes I just treat them as if they do, and it usually works.
This is so good. Do you guys find that 4s, do you feel like they're so introspective that they don't need therapy, but or do they kind of, once they get into therapy, like type 1s, they kind of stay in therapy for a long time? What have you guys observed?
Introspection is not self-awareness. If they keep recycling the same thing over and over again,
Yep,
they're more self-focused. And so part of it
it's like
is
your own little echo chamber.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so focusing on relationships, I think, is an important way in to the 4's work, because other people are in the 4/zone. So there's a lot of this like push and pull dynamic, or like pursuer withdrawer dynamic, where like kind of depending on what type the other people are. If it's, let's say, a group context like work or community, family, church, whatever, it's like being the black sheep, the whistleblower, the rebel, like the exile, whatever. There's kind of like a social role piece to the 4. And then if it's more of like a one-on-one relationship, it's like magnets, like that switch back and forth. If the person's close, they get bored and they want the drama and the intensity because they're intensity junkies. And so they're like, I don't want to be around you, or like, I don't deserve to be around you. And then when the person's far away, I was like, oh, I missed you so much. And that whole thing. So I think because relationships are more concrete than existential, deep purpose, meaning oriented topics, where, 4s can have ideas of the people they're in relationships with, and there's the actual people involved. So sometimes like inviting in their partner or their family member might be helpful, so the therapist can see, oh, like I had this whole idea of this person based on how the 4 described them, and now I see this person as they actually are. Like, there's a world of a difference.
That's good. Introspection is not self-awareness. That is really a good statement.
4s will get offended by that, though. I'll just give you a heads up.
Well, before we go to 5s, I just want to say I do appreciate all the 4s watching and those who are therapists. You look at guys like Dr. Curt Thompson and other 4s who are just leading voices because they get the internal world. When they're healthy, they're just prophetic in our culture and really helpful, especially right now since post-COVID, since there's just a boom of people that are needing help and coming to you guys. So I really appreciate the 4s, and I want them to hear that before we transition to 5s.
Can I say one last piece?
For sure.
Very short. Self-preservation 4s are the 4s that don't look like 4s. They look like all the other types, depending on their mood. And the main piece for them is that they're the ones who suffer silently solo. And they get mistyped a lot and sometimes get turned off by the Enneagram because of that. And so for self-pres 4s, their growth path involves practicing more the traditional 4-ish behaviors, like complaining more often in real time to more people, which feels like pulling teeth, but is absolutely necessary for them to recognize just how much they're struggling outside of this idea of I need to be a strong person who can withstand a lot of things.
It's good, Joanne. Thank you. All right, let's transition to 5s. What do you guys have for 5s?
I don't see many 5s unless they're brought in for marital. So I'm curious about the rest of you and your experience with 5s.
I would agree with that, Leslie. When I see 5s coming in, it's with a partner. Often. And it's when I think about attachment styles, I think about that avoidant attachment style. So you've probably got an avoidant attached person, the partner that's the Enneagram 5, and then you've got them paired maybe with an anxious style, and they activate each other. And they're coming in to kind of work on that.
Oh man, just the one triggering the other.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've noticed just doing Enneagram work, not as a therapist, it's really hard to get them to open up because of the privacy. They have such good boundaries, and they don't want me talking about the Enneagram a lot of times because it feels like I'm reading their mail, I'm jumping over the fence, getting into the castle, and it can be very, very uncomfortable. And so that's interesting to hear you guys kind of say that you've experienced a little bit of that in therapy as well, that it's kind of hard to get over the wall or those privacy fences.
Yeah. My experience with 5s, I've seen a couple, and you won't get the full picture until you've been working with them for like a year. And then they'll drop this bomb on you and they're like, oh my God, everything makes sense now. It's like this really pertinent piece of information. And then you finally get the full picture. And then you're like, all right, now we can do some work.
Oh my goodness.
It's fascinating. It happened to me one of my fives I was working with recently, I was like, why have we never talked about this? And she's like,
Like, you never asked.
she knows the Enneagram too, so we kind of had a good laugh about it.
Besides like relationship issues, professionally, fives can struggle a lot because they spend so much time in their head and don't take a whole lot of action, being action repressed. Like, they can mull over something for forever and then make a decision kind of more reluctantly because there's like a deadline or like stuff like that. And so they might expend a whole lot more mental energy than the task actually requires. And so that's been a struggle that I've seen quite often. And either teammates at work or spouses get super frustrated because like there's this delay effect.
Leslie, I think you were going to share something, and then I also want to hear from you guys to see if there's any like general anxiety disorder or if there's any other disorders that you see with fives. I would be curious to know what you see.
Well, I was just going to say, similar to Joanne sharing about the space and the time need, I see a lot of fives that need the encouragement to be allowed to answer questions off the cuff, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of fives. They would prefer to speak accurately, and accuracy takes time and reflection and information. And so being allowed to say, you can change your answer down the road. We're not holding you to this. I would just love to hear what you are able to track or notice. And you can circle back anytime it's okay to not quite get it. But there's just a tension around speaking off the cuff for a lot of fives. And therapy is so in the moment so often. And I think that I've seen that barrier.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed with my own mother is a type 5 is maybe this is like you shared with the ones. They're looking for the perfect therapist. Like I know for my mother who's a 5 and a wonderful 5, there's only like a particular kind of person that she'll go to. And so maybe is it a little bit like that too? That maybe 5s have a hard time of going to a therapist that they view as maybe competent or I don't know if you've seen that, but I was just thinking about that off the top of my head.
I wonder if there's a conflict between what they want and what they need when they're looking for a therapist. What they're wanting is someone who's, right, as intellectual as they are, can kind of recite things to them, can lay it out very rationally and logically. But maybe what they need is someone who can sit there and hold space and invite the emotion, invite the questions, invite uncertainty, and let that be a safe place for them to feel that. But I think there's a conflict there.
It's good. If there's any further thoughts, you can jump in. Otherwise, let's move to type 6.
This is my number. I can jump in and say something since I'm a 6 and I've done a lot of therapy on both sides of the chair. I really think being allowed to name, and this is how the Enneagram changed my life. And it felt again, like kind of somebody had jumped into my backyard and had been stalking me, and all that exposure was challenging. But to name these dualistic experiences of having some love-hate for things, having some fear and courage for things, having this extreme dependent times and extreme independent times, almost showing up like disorganized attachment, if you're familiar with kind of the sort of bifurcation of both anxious and avoidant styles. And there's just a lot that feels kind of like this internal turmoil. And until a lot of 6s get any Enneagram language, they can just feel kind of crazy. Anything from paranoid to bipolar to, just to have somebody name this internal phobic to counterphobic continuum in a way that's safe and feeling seen and loved in that, and where the gifting is in that, I think is huge for 6s. And it's been really important for my own freedom, my own work, to not feel like I am two different people, even though I can experience these extreme differences and this back and forth.
That's really good, Leslie.
Yeah, Leslie. I'm married to a 6, so
Right.
I wish I would have heard that 18 years ago to know that I was marrying a bundle of opposites who could, swing on a pendulum and to just show compassion and have empathy for that and come alongside them and not freak out about it.
I wonder if one thing that gets outsourced by sixes is power and authority, disconnecting from their own power and authority, projecting it outwards, and then someone else takes on that power and authority. And then the six, depending on the subtype, have different ways of interacting with the projected person. So having this sometimes conflictual relationship with authority figures, or like completely fusing and aligning with them. And that because of that, the growth path for sixes involve recognizing that a lot of their mental activity or their anxiety or whatever comes from them having disconnected from their own power. Their work is to bring that back. Take ownership, make a decision, be decisive, and then own the outcomes of their decision, knowing that they can make new decisions along the way so that they don't need to make this huge, big decision up front that might set them off on a forever path, and having more boldness and courage to face each moment for what it is.
I mean, just saying to sixes, what do you want in this situation? What are you thinking? What are you hoping for? What's been working for you? What's not been working for you? Anything that they can name on their own, because we're a both and. We are a flight risk because we get suspicious that you're seeing something wrong with us, and we are over relying on authorities. And so there's kind of this challenge there. We don't want to over rely on the therapist's authority. We need to develop that gut-centered self-attachment. But then we also we can be a flight risk if we feel unsafe or we perceive something is unsafe in the relationship. So that is an interesting balance.
The one thing that I'll say about working with sixes is that, because they're thinking dominant and thinking repressed, they are really good at rationalizing a lot of their fears and all of their worst case scenarios. And they do really value their ability to kind of scan the horizon. And so, like, a therapist does have to be very gentle in their challenging of those, like, thinking patterns, because a six identifies with them very strongly. And so if you're like, hey, that's not totally real, or that's not totally a great way of thinking, that can be really challenging for the therapeutic relationship. So you have to be really gentle in how you challenge some of their anxieties and some of their fears.
I think to Leslie's point, and then what you shared, Whitney, that's just me talking not as a therapist because I'm not one, but just from experience of having, being married to a six and then also having a counterphobic six son. There's lots of conversations about authority, and I'm not sure if that plays out in therapy with sixes, of like maybe kind of directing your attention towards some of those issues in their life and helping them work through issues of authority, like being overly trusting of authority. Like, I know my wife is very trusting of me. It makes me wonder sometimes, like, oh, I think she's leaning on me too much or trusts me too much. Like, she's fighting for me like an 8. And I'm like, I don't know if I deserve that, or she should be doing that. She's just so like loyal, to me. And then my son is just, as a counterphobic 6, just rebels against all authority. And he's like a master rationalizer. He finds ways to get out of being under my authority.
It also sounds like your son has a 7 wing. He's able to figure out how to get out from under your authority pretty easily or quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it feels like he accesses both pretty well. Anything else? Observations on sixes? Oh, go ahead, Eden.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as you said, authority, I really thought of the word safety. And I think that is what authority and like that's the testing of authority in the counter. Is a counterphobic, right? That pushes against is really wanting to know that they're safe, that they're going to be safe, right? In these relationships, in life. And when I'm working with sixes, I think that's part of the work that I do. Even like, hey, what makes you feel safe in this room, right? Like kind of building up that internal sense and intuitive sense of safety and power, Joanne, like that they can hold that sense, or what gives them that sense on their own, apart from these outsourced source of power.
Maybe
It's
along
good, Eden.
those lines, like moving away from polarization and more integration, that they can be steady and exposed to risk all at the same time. That one does not negate the other. But it's more like knowing how to rest in that in between.
And build up the tolerance for feeling
Yeah.
unsafe sometimes, because
Yeah.
this is not a safe world in a lot of ways. It's not guaranteed, right? And so building Eden, I love your like, what is safe for you? How do we create that? But then at the same time, building the tolerance around not always feeling safe, but feeling connected and embodied, like Joanne was saying. That's so important. And the more sixes trust their gut, the more they can weather unsafe times, unsafe or truly unsafe experiences.
This has been great, guys. Talking about issues of authority, safety, like you mentioned, Eden, helping them to feel safe. A lot of sixes struggle with anxiety, and so helping them with that and helping to give them compassion for the anxiety they're feeling, which I think is just an outworking of their strength of protecting, of seeing what could go wrong in order to protect their loved ones. And so that they feels like they're hardwired with vigilance for a positive reason to protect. And you can see why they would get anxious because that vigilance is starting to get out of hand a little bit. But just to be a source of bring a sense of reassurance and comfort to them, to help them to realize that they're not the problem. There's not something wrong with them is incredibly helpful. Okay, let's move to type 7s.
That hard is harder for 7s. That is my internal mantra. And I believe it, and I feel for them in it.
Does anybody want to build off of that? Hard is harder? What you mean by that, Leslie, or stories or anything else you want to share?
I mean, what I mean by that is the tolerance for suffering, if it hasn't been built, and it gets built in different ways, and often it gets built in ways you didn't sign up for, but the tolerance for pain, the tolerance for hard things, for taking responsibility for themselves, for moving away from satisfaction and demand, from moving away from more is more. It just seems to me that their capacity and tolerance around suffering is just very challenging for them. If it can't kind of be moved forward quickly or bypassed with information or something, it's just so hard to weather a lot of the pain of just suffering of various kinds. So to me, I really do feel for them that the hard feels a lot harder than maybe some of us might approach hard.
Yeah. And I would almost say it's like they're not even experiencing the suffering. So it's almost like they haven't like built a tolerance. There's so much compartmentalization of the suffering. I'm married to a 7, so I could talk all day about what goes on with the 7. But in my experience, 7s do have a lot of addiction. There's a lot of suicidal ideation, sometimes even suicidal attempts. Can have a lot of anxiety, but a lot of anger at the same time. As a therapist, you will need to catch their reframing at like every turn, because you'll say something and challenge them, and then they'll bring something else up to kind of negate what you said. And it's very rational and logical, but you gotta catch them in it. Because like you were saying, Tyler, like about your son, which was what was making me think that, that 7 wing, like they're so good at arguing and coming up with all different kinds of reasons about why something will work, or, whatever their side of the argument is. They're so sophisticated and so quick at being able to come up with arguments for their side. And that is one of the reasons why it's really hard for them to change, and even to be motivated to change. And like, they do have to have some internal motivation or it's not going to happen. Like, external motivators don't really do it. I'm often telling my clients, or even my clients who have 7 children, like, you can try to give them all the consequences you want. Like, life ultimately is going to be what teaches them those lessons, those like unchangeable situations that they can't just negotiate themselves out of. Those are the things that are going to be motivating to them and finally give them some kind of internal motivation for change. They can have a lot of difficulty making life decisions. They can have difficulty caring for themselves. And I honestly think because they are, they are repressed in feeling, and they have no intuitive line or access to feeling and emotions. Like, emotion education and awareness is a non-negotiable treatment goal. Like, sometimes they will say that they know what emotions are, but like, do they actually experience them and emote them and talk about them with their loved ones? Like, that takes so much work for a 7 to be able to do. And it takes a lot of patience for them as well.
Those are good thoughts, Whitney. So when does a 7 show up in your guys' office? What's happened? Can you speak to that? Is it an addiction?
Sometimes I think it's like the people in their lives that are like, we can't do this anymore. Like, you have got to do something. A lot of times 7s will work their way into a relationship where the other people are changing so that they don't have to change. Other people are kind of picking up the slack or enabling their behaviors in a lot of ways. And so a lot of times it is like the people in their lives are like, listen, we're not going to do that anymore. And having to hold that firm boundary with them. That's when I see them, or addiction, for sure.
I like thinking about 7s in the context of the idealist triangle along with 1s and 4s. It's like the 3-legged stool. We need all 3 legs to be even. It kind of like also overlaps with like the internal family system model of like the 1s being the grown-up, the 4s being the teenagers, and the 7s being the kids. But we have all of them, regardless of our type. And when we overly rely on one leg of the stool and we underutilize the other ones, then things are just going to fall apart at some point. And so the piece that I think 7s outsource to other people, suffering, responsibilities, type 4, type 1. And so like somebody else in their life probably occupies those positions, even if they're not 1s and 4s. Like, there's a lot of 7s in relationships with very responsible people, and they get resentful, so drag the 7 into couples therapy or whatnot. But up until then, the partners or family members are the ones who are just putting in so much, and that is that external motivation. Like, 7s are getting all this pressure from the outside, but because they themselves don't want to do it, it's not personally important to them. They just need to wait out a storm of the other person's complaints, and eventually the person's going to give up and they're just going to do it themselves until the relationship gets so strained that the person who's been kind of nagging or whatever, it's like, I ain't doing this anymore, I'm out. And then all of a sudden the 7's alone. It's like, well, where did you go? And then they have all these bills to pay and like things that they've completely neglected. So I think a lot of times the way to get a 7's attention is that rock bottom experience, either through addictions or divorce or whatever. They lose their job, where they don't have any more options like literally available to them. And if a 7 happens to make their way into therapy and they're open because they have no other options and life has already fallen apart, I like using the metaphor of the human body made of flesh and bone. If you have no structure in the human body and it's just a bag of skin and organs on the floor, that person's not living in the same way that a person who's all bones and no flesh is not living either. So structure, order, organization, responsibility, the things that the 7 resists actually bring about the very life force that makes life as beautiful as it is. So if 7s are seeking freedom, to thinking that freedom equals no limits, then they're going to paint themselves into a corner where they're completely restricted. The opposite of which is, if they actually choose limits and self-imposed limits, which is basically taking responsibility, then they have all these options available. So I think like there's some part of like maybe mentally or intellectually like mapping that out for them, saying like, I know you want freedom. I want that for you too. Let's not get into a power struggle between the therapist and the client. But how can you actually give real freedom for yourself by voluntarily opting into some of these responsibilities? I think the power struggle piece is pretty big with 7s because they're very good at weaseling their way out of it. And so I think it's important for therapists to not get caught up in that either by becoming the next nagging person. So having a more neutral, like more passive posture.
It's good, Joanne. Some really deep and profound thoughts there. As we move to type 8, because we have to keep moving here, and we have 2 more types. But I'll just make a note that, you know, if you have a friend or family member or partner that's assertive type, like a 3, 7, or 8, or maybe a 5 who doesn't want to open up, it's okay to call them out and say, hey, I'm not okay with this anymore, this behavior. We need to go and get help. I didn't want to get help when my marriage was struggling, maybe 4 or 5 years into marriage, but my wife as a 6 had enough courage to come out and say, this is not okay. You're working too much. You're always listening to hundreds of podcasts, filling your mind like there's no space for me. This is a problem. And she was able to do that as a 6. For 9s, and other types, it might be harder to say that. So we're just giving you all permission here to come at the 3s like me, or the 7s or 8s if you're married to an assertive type or no assertive type, and it's harder because they have more power, more energy, but to have permission to call them out and say, hey, we need to get some help. We'll keep you from getting stuck. And so have the courage to get them into the counseling office. Okay, with that said, let's move now to the 8s. What do you guys want to share about the 8s? What do you guys see?
I love working with 8s. I didn't think I would, because as a 6, I can be intimidated by powerful frameworks, words, energy, dominant energy, that kind of thing. But I really enjoy working with 8s. But something Joanne said, I see it, you said it around 3s, and I think it's similar with 8. Being able to describe, this is kind of what the counseling process is. This is what you may be frustrated by, but just know that you can get through that. We're going to get to this kind of outcome. I feel like 8s in my caseload are the most likely to wonder if we're making enough progress, or if they have enough of a sense of are we doing the things we should be doing with our time, or there's just a lot of that evaluative presence around outcomes, progress, moving. And so I think, like you said, outlining some of the ups and downs of this alinear experience can be helpful to validate for them that it isn't going to be maybe that linear. And so to normalize that early and empathize with that early.
Leslie, I love what you said about like when 8s come into the room, the dominant energy. I know immediately when an 8 comes in the room, because I feel that wave of intimidation, right? And you're like, okay, here we are, right? Like, gotcha, right? Like, and then being able to, I think in my attachment work as a therapist, I understand that as this is how people outside of this room can experience this individual. And this is an experience that they have. Wow. And they have that experience of people reacting against this intimidation. And that may be part of why they're coming into the room.
That's good, Eden.
In my experience working with 8s, their future orientation is often what is giving them so much trouble, like in relationships or even with themselves. Like they have a hard time like stopping and pausing and attending to like their own physical pain or their own emotional pain. because they're doing dominant. They can like shut all that off and just like get the job done and move on to the next thing, so that anything like any pain is often cannot be attended to. And so having them slow down is really important. And the thing that I see sometimes is like, we'll talk about a problem or an issue, especially an emotional one or something that's causing some kind of relational conflict. And then the next session, we don't talk about it again. And I'm like, hey, we got to go back around to that thing. I know you've already moved on to like the next problem or the next issue, but like this is a big deal. We need to keep giving this attention. And they sometimes don't like that, but it is that future orientation. It's just like, okay, well, that's done, and now I'm moving on, and now I'm going to get on with the next thing. I also see them struggle a lot at work, and like it's the same struggle with authority, but theirs is, I think, very different because they often don't see an authority figure that's worth following or that's doing the job that they think should be done. And so just that like conflict that they see so much with their bosses or like their organization at large doing the things that they don't agree with can often cause a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, a lot of just dissatisfaction.
That's a good observation, Whitney. Just that you might be talking with an 8 about work dynamics, bosses, authority figures. That's really helpful. And going back to what you said, Eden, about the privilege of working up close with an 8 and seeing some of their emotions and softer side that other people don't get to see, that was really sweet. The 8s are so great when you can get up close with them. My other son's a type 8, so yeah,
a lot of energy in that house.
Yeah.
I know, a counterphobic 6 son and an 8 son, and I'm a heart type, so I'm just like, yeah. Are you thankful for me? Do you love me? Why are you mad at me? That's how my conversations go, and I realize I'm very high maintenance when it comes to needing like love and affirmation back. When it's good.
I think the action orientation of type 8, forward movement, forward focus, not a whole lot of patience for the nitty-gritty details. They're like high-level visionaries. Like, I just want this. Let's get there. Like, what's in the way? Why are you causing trouble? It's like, stop complaining. Move. So in terms of like communication style with 8s, I think this is the case for across all types. When we're interacting with someone of a certain type, the more we double down in our own type, the more intense their patterns get. On the other hand, if we move closer to them and act like they act generally, then that minimizes the polarization. So talking to an 8, open chest, direct eye contact, like own your own power and engage them directly and get straight to the point. Don't explain a whole lot. Don't apologize. Like, just say the thing that needs to be said. Say the action item. I think that will smooth out a lot of relationships just like off the bat. Not all 8s are angry all the time. I think that's a misconception. I think they're very big presence, very energetic, very intense. So I think that maybe like conflict, engagement, colliding with the 8 is a form of intimacy. So when other people pull away and they withdraw, the 8's like, where'd you go? Comes after them. And then other people like avoid the 8 even further, and that's a whole cycle. So I think it's because opposites attract. Those who are in relationship with 8s probably need to like gear up and then actually own their power and strength, and then the 8 doesn't have to be as strong because someone else is doing it. Like even with like leadership, like 8s don't sense that anyone else is like a good enough leader, that they occupy the space, but they don't themselves want to be the leader. So I think in relationship context, that's a lot of where the 8's patterns show up, because relationships are in the blind spot of the 8. And so I don't know if 8s would readily hear, like, in order for you to improve your relationships, therefore you need to do X, Y, Z, because I don't know if they have the patience for that. But like speaking to them, like, if you want to make a bigger impact in your life, then you have to know how to work with people. And that is why it's important to work on relationships. It's kind of like coming in through the back door.
Well put, Joanne. Okay, we got to move on to type 9s. our last type. So let's do it. Let's finish the circle here. What do you guys have for type 9s?
I'll jump in first off. My husband's a 9, and the 9s that I've interacted with in my office as well, there's such a loss of self that they have no idea what they want, or they want everything because everything sounds plausible, right? And so there's kind of an aimlessness maybe that's there. I would also say that some 9s may never even make it into the therapy office because their mental health symptoms become psychosomatic, enter their body instead of their mental health. It goes into a different category. So they're going to develop physical symptoms versus emotional symptoms. I have 9s that come in with like heart palpitations that develop, or with digestive issues. And they're going to seek out support around that before they even come to a therapist, because that's the issue, not the emotions that have built up in their body over time.
That's great, Eden. Yeah, that makes total sense. Not even being a therapist, knowing that 9s suppress their anger, deny their anger, but it's got to go somewhere. And so you're saying it shows up in the body. That's really insightful.
Yeah, they kind of want to avoid anything uncomfortable, like uncomfortable emotions, physical sensations, anything in relationships that's uncomfortable. They really will try to just not be present for it. I had a client who gave me some really good analogies for 9s, and she was like, it's like we play possum. Like something uncomfortable comes up and we're like, whoop, bye. They just kind of check out. They numb themselves so much. And so I think for 9s, a lot of my work is just like honoring the feelings that they have instead of numbing the feelings. They can be so hard to get to do any kind of like action-oriented therapy work or like creating any kind of change. So a lot of motivational interviewing. Again, sometimes I have a lot of 9s that show some like ADHD type symptoms. So there's a lot of kind of working through some of that. A good thing that I think it was Joe Stabile, Suzanne's husband, said one time that an interesting relationship between 9s and 1s and anger and sadness. Like when a 9 is sad, they're actually angry. And when a 1 is angry, they're actually sad. And so like 9s do kind of tend towards more like depression or sadness. But when you really get down to it, they're probably actually really angry about something. And they've just never attended to that anger or like the boundaries that were violated or them not getting their needs met. And so they're sad about it, but they're actually really angry. It's just so interesting to be kind of delving into that with them. And a lot of the like kind of what Eden was saying, but also that more tending towards depression, do see quite a bit of suicidal ideation with 9s as well.
Wow. That's very powerful, Whitney. The feelings, having it come out in sadness. I can see that with some 9s too, talking a lot about painful experiences in the past and continuing to talk about them and bring them up over and over again, being sort of sad about it. But it just is a loop that never stops. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, and it's like their orientation to the past is how they define themselves. And so it's hard for them to just process through everything in the past so that they can move forward. They get really stuck, like you were talking.
And great plug for 1s too, to realize for yourself when you're angry, to realize that you're really sad. So we can have more compassion on our 1s. That's helpful too. I've been hearing some things about 9s I've never heard before. This is very helpful for me. Any last thoughts on type 9s?
I will just say that I've been encouraging 9s to do group therapy. The individual relationship can be really intense for 9s because they don't always want to do that deeper process work, and they don't want to go to the anger, which they have to in order to process pain. But group work can feel a little bit like more collaborative, and it can also feel like they have some shared space and it's not so intense on them, and that maybe they can kind of build some camaraderie with other people. And I've just seen some really big shifts when I've sent clients that are nines to do group work alongside our individual work.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I mentioned earlier that like therapy itself is a very four-ish space, and the four is known as the individualist, and I think that's the opposite for nines in like blending in and merging with something else to not be a self. Like usually people think of like sloth as lack of activity. So there's a lot of action focus. So I think for nines, it's a disconnection from self, like falling asleep to oneself, disconnecting from self-agency. So I think of nines like a car in neutral gear, whereas type 3, that line is like being the gas pedal, and the type 6 being the brake pedal. You need all three to have a functioning car. And so inaction is itself an action. And often nines, like say in relationships or at work, find themselves being more kind of reactionary to what others around them do, not knowing that part of the reason why like pressure is applied to them is because they've disconnected from their own initiative engine. And so I've heard that like the most powerful type in all the Enneagram types is actually type 9, not type 8, not type 1, not the more like assertively known types. But when a 9 taps into their internal world, like, you better get out of the way. There's no stopping them. So I think a lot of body work is pretty good. For better or for worse, I think 9s tend to be conduits for energy, absorbing other people's stuff or absorbing nature's energy. And I think in that sense, body movement might be a good way to metabolize some of the uncomfortable experiences more than like talk therapy or like mental or emotional work.
Yeah, tacking onto that, Joanne, I will point my 9s to spending time in nature, going to a park, sticking their feet in the earth, having some way of connecting with that. Animal therapy, right? Pets can be a powerful resource for 9s. And then body work too. Those are, because there's no perspective there to merge to, right? It feels safe in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And because they spend so much of their time being hypervigilant and like assessing other people and perceiving and observing everyone else, kind of looking out for conflict. Like that goes right along with what you were saying, Eden. Like if they can tune into their body or nature or animals, like they don't have to be hypervigilant and like be protecting of themselves.
And the hypervigilance is very draining. Very draining.
And Whitney, I'd heard Suzanne say on, maybe it was in a conversation with me, I can't remember now. I think we were going around and talking about different correlations she had seen with mental health. And she'd said like 9s, she saw a lot of 9s with ADD, which is now falls under the ADHD umbrella. And so is it the non-attentive kind of ADHD? Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just something to be aware of when you're working with 9s, if you're a therapist.
Or like the combined type too.
You mentioned, Whitney, they can play possum, which is really good. A good illustration. And just like 6s kind of swing on that pendulum of phobic to counterphobic. Do you guys experience 9s as sometimes swing on the pendulum from like playing possum to then making dramatic moves? Do you see any of that that's causing any issues to be aware of? Leslie, you're nodding your head. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think from session to session, I can see the inertia principle, like whether they've been in low energy and so there's tons of low energy in the session, or they're in that inertia and there's lots of energy. And I think 9s, both they're one wing and just who they are, there's a lot of idealism. And so sometimes I say this about 9s, I don't know if I'm right, but it's like they can envision things from a 3 space, but they can't carry them out. And so I'll see like big endeavors or big words without the work, but like big words about what's going to happen, what they're going to do, what they're going to tackle. But I know they don't have the energy to match that. but we need to kind of titrate down to something that is doable so they can actually feel self-esteem from it.
That's good. That's helpful. I see some other people nodding. So I must agree with you, Leslie.
Yeah, I usually at the end of every session with a 9, we have concrete goals that they're supposed to achieve between that session and the next one.
That's so good, Whitney. And I have a Type 9 book club right now, and one guy just emailed me today saying that he had read through it, but now being in a group with other 9s, he's getting so much more out of it because they're challenging each other and spurring one another on. And so I like what you guys said about maybe the group work, or even just being with you, being in a room with somebody else that can hold them accountable, help them set goals, like you just said, Whitney. That can be incredibly helpful for a 9. So if you're a 9, just know that you don't have to do it by yourself or try to do it alone. So yeah, that's really good. Okay, we're at time. Please share where we can find you guys online. If any resources you want to point us to. Let's start with you, Whitney. I would love for people to continue to learn from you, like I've learned from you today. So where can we find you?
Yeah, so my group practice is Brave Haven Counseling. We're in Richardson, Texas. You can find our website, www.bravehavencounseling.com. And then on Instagram, our Instagram handle is at Brave Haven Counseling, and my individual Instagram is at Whitney LPC.
Awesome. And all the links you've already given me, so I'll put them down in the show notes so people can easily click on those. So you don't have to take any notes right now. But thank you, Whitney. What about you, Eden? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I counsel out of Charlotte, North Carolina, but I serve Texas and North Carolina when it comes to therapy work with individuals and couples. And that practice is insideoutcollaborative.com. And then I also do attachment coaching with couples and individuals outside of those states as well. So that there's a little bit about that at insideoutcollaborative.com, but also edenhyder.com. And my Instagram is at edenhyder. And that podcast that has more attachment focused material is Inside Out Podcast. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Eden. Leslie, remind us where we can find you again.
Yeah, just Leslie Bley Counseling. I have a team of therapists under me here in Austin. I'm also licensed in Missouri, so Texas and Missouri residents. And if you're a therapist, you can find resources like Enneagram for counselors and the counselor vitality groups that are all on that same website. And then I'm also EnneagramConsultant.com for more professional use of the Enneagram with teams and companies that want that kind of lens for understanding their staff.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. And thanks for all the work that you've been doing and creating community for other counselors and therapists. That's been really beneficial. And Joanne, where can we find you?
So with my Enneagram therapist hat on, I'm in California in the Silicon Valley, and I have a freebie guide, The Emotional Habits of Enneagram Types, because each of the types have different ways of dealing with the emotions mad, sad, glad, scared, numb. And with my, I'm also a feelings translator on the side, and that's beyond the state of California as well. And I built a school about feelings, and in a way that's not just for heart types, so that people of whatever types can recognize that emotions have a central spot in helping us be more well-rounded. They have a logic of their own, and there's some action items that go along with them. So, and you can find me at intelligentemotions.com or on Instagram at intelligentemotions.
Fascinating. A feelings translator.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And the feelings resource. That's why I appreciate having all of you on. Your different Enneagram types. You all have different strengths. And I just want to thank you for joining me. I know it's really hard. You're all professionals. You have clients. It's hard to find a time to get us all together, but we did it. And I'm so thankful for you. And I know those watching are thankful as well to have learned from you. I know I learned from something from each of you guys that I didn't know before. And so this was really helpful to me. And I know it's helpful to the Enneagram enthusiasts out there, the therapists out there. So thank you so much for just carving out this space to be a blessing to so many people. And a reminder to those watching, make sure to go back and check out all the other panels today, the heart types, the head types, so many great panels to listen to today to really get a feel for all the Enneagram types when it comes to their own personal mental health stories. So make sure to go and check those out today. And if you don't have time to watch all the panels today, you can get the All Access Pass, which will give you lifetime access to all of the panels and all of the sessions and all the transcripts for this whole EnneaSummit. So if that interests you, make sure to go check out that. But thank you so much for joining us today. Before you head over to the next interview, the next panel, remember to do two things: like seek support and share compassion, because you are not alone.